You're not going to be seeing Jeffrey Snover tonight. Trust me.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Research Triangle PowerShell user group. We're super glad to have you. If you certainly have been here before, we're glad to have you, but also remember that this is posted up on YouTube, so we'll certainly present it there. Tonight's talk is going to be by Mike Kanakos, our very own Mike Kanakos, getting started with Azure DevOps. So tell me about yourself, Mike. How you doing?
Hey, Phil. Nice to meet you. So for the guys and girls that are in this group, I'm sure you all know who I am, but if you're watching this at home, my name is Mike Kanakos. I'm an infrastructure tools engineer for Invisalign. My focus is really AD all day, directory services, Azure certificates, Azure DevOps, enterprise applications, OAuth registrations. And for the past 6 to 8 months, I've been focusing on building sort of tools to help other team members or other teams try to eliminate tasks that are redundant or very manual driven. So I've been focusing on building tools for our team and other teams focused on directory services stuff. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP, so I do a lot of stuff in the community. But basically, I just like to come and hang out with the group and share some knowledge.
So in gathering all that information there as well, is that what really was the fruition or the culmination of this talk as well, is to try and use that knowledge that you've gathered using DevOps to say, hey, what can you do with this and really go beyond what you can do? Is that what this is?
Yeah, to some extent. So the reason that I'm doing this talk is really a summary of what my group is using at work to schedule automation. So about a year ago, when we started doing more and more automation, and I was a little bit newer to the team, I've only been with the team for a year and a half, I was thinking PowerShell jobs, using this task scheduler, maybe like PowerShell Universal, whatever. And my manager is a very forward-looking guy, and he came from a cloud background, and he says, I don't want to have really anything on-prem if we don't have to. I'd rather leverage the cloud. So let's find a solution in the Azure cloud. So that was the genesis of this. And my manager had some experience with this, so we were really catching up to him. And since then, I sort of, myself and another gentleman, we handle most of the scheduling of automation in our group. And Azure DevOps is a tool that I'm in pretty much every day. The difference here is that I called this talk for sysadmins because I was going to mention this in a few minutes. I could start with that now, which is that I think a lot of people just assume that when you hear Azure DevOps, it's a DevOps oriented service, and that's where you need to be in order to use it. And while that is certainly a true statement, that is not a requirement. And as everyone will see here in a little bit, there's more than enough tools to easily replace the task. The problem is there's a lot of tools, right? So you just have to boil down and see what to use. So I figured, why not share some knowledge of stuff we're doing at work? And maybe I can help some other people maybe do what we're doing. So that's how we got started with this.
And then from that is basically understanding that hey, you can do a lot more than what we're going to talk about at this point. But at this point, it's really to see and to plant the seed in everybody's mind here at this point, say that we can go from there and really understand that it can do one thing, but look beyond that one thing and find the other things.
Yeah. So I guess the most important thing to take away from what you just said, Phil, is that I'm not presenting this talk as someone who's saying, this is the way you need to do Azure DevOps. Instead, you should be watching this talk with, here's how we solve the problem at our work. And maybe the solution might work for you. However, maybe someone in the audience tonight has a better solution than what I'm proposing or offering, or maybe they can offer me some tips that I haven't picked up yet. So this is a knowledge share. This is certainly not coming from the point of being an Azure DevOps expert, and I'm going to know every button and every switch in the interface. But I can tell you that my team has probably 18 to 20 jobs that run, and some of them are running hourly. And when you calculate that out over time, over months. We've had 6,000 runs through Azure DevOps of automation. So we've gotten our feet wet with this and we feel pretty confident in how it works. So I think it's a useful tool to share to people to see what's possible.
Let's get started.
All right. All right. I think maybe we'll start with going right into the interface. And I have a couple of different ideas about what I might want to do tonight. Before I get into any of that, let me get some stuff here set. Where the heck is? Okay, there we go. Sorry guys, bear with me 1 second. So I'm just going to close some of these guys here that I don't need anymore. All right. I'm going to go through the entire Azure DevOps interface here as best I can, but I want to jump right in and show you what Azure DevOps is, and then we'll come back and we'll explain everything. Rather than me going on for 45 minutes about every switch and every nook and cranny, and then you never know how it works. A quick little run through. I have a lab running. I have 2 DCs and a build box. Right now, I'm only running 1 DC in the build box. That's all I really need for tonight. So my environment is an on-prem Active Directory running in my lab, the Azure Cloud, Azure DevOps, and a code repository. Now, one big caveat that I just want to explain to people is that you can connect your on-prem AD to the Azure Cloud and sync those two so that your on-prem accounts now live out in the Azure Cloud, and then you can use single sign-on and third-party services and all the things that Azure offers. But you don't need to do that for this to work. And as a matter of fact, in my demo here, I don't have any connection between my on-prem AD and the Azure Cloud. So that's not a requirement, but just so everybody's clear. So when you see that I'm logging into Azure, you may be assuming, oh, it's because he's got an account synced up. No, I have a standalone Azure environment that I've poked a hole into my lab environment, and that's how I'm doing this work. So with that being said, quick level set, we have a box here called DC01. It's a DC, as I'm sure you can imagine. And we have an Azure build box, which I wasn't expecting that to be open. Okay, an Azure build box here. And the Azure build box, I'll explain in a second, but in the simplest terms, Azure is reaching out to a server on-prem, and that on-prem server is doing work. And I'll go more into this in a second, but what we're going to do here is I'm going to just show you a very quick demo here. So I have this is a list of my jobs here. And I've set up this pipeline here, and I'm going to run it, and I'll show you what it's going to do here. And what that's going to do, if things are going to work correctly, is that should go out and reach out to this machine, create an RTP SUG demo folder. And did that just run already? 8:30? No, that's old. Let me delete that. I thought I deleted this already. All right. It should create a file in here. Okay. As you can see, this job is running here. If I click this, I'm going to explain all this. I'm not going to, and my script failed. Yeah, that's awesome. Oh, the file already existed. So let's run that again. All right, so tonight, while we're waiting for this to run, what we're hoping to see is a hello world.txt file that's going to show up here. This job is running in the background here. It's queued. It's running now. You can see the icon here. I'll explain all that in a second. What are we going to be talking about tonight while this is running? I'm going to be showing you the various options that you can employ through Azure DevOps. This, oh, come on, job failed again. What the hell is going on here? Of course. It wants to, I didn't realize I made it delete the whole folder. All right. Anyway, Try that one more
So
time.
I think at this point, it's a good point to figure out is that when you're running these jobs, it's just as easy to come in here, and because you people have experience with PowerShell at this point, you can very quickly here and figure out. So granted, a PowerShell script is running somewhere in Azure Cloud, somewhere at that point, and so it can do work, and you can just easily, while the job's running, is to look at that code. So that's really the core at this point. So is that a good point?
Yeah, and I was going to cover that. And I will be honest, I'm perfectly fine if demos fail tonight because that's part of running pipelines. Jobs fail, you need to be able to troubleshoot why. And it makes it very easy to troubleshoot because what happens is pointed out very quickly. I wanted to get through one so that someone can see what a job is that runs. Okay, so I got a green check here, so that ran, and we should have a new folder, R2P-seg demo, hello world, there we go. Very exciting. Okay, so what just happened when we did that? So I made a quickie diagram here, and I'm going to explain this. So just to get everybody on the same page, we're working out in the Azure cloud. Inside the Azure cloud, there's Azure DevOps, the service, and there's Azure AD, but I also have an on-prem AD in my local network. So what I've done is I've configured Azure DevOps to talk to a server that's on-prem here, and that server is going to do work for me. Now, I have two arrows here because one of the great things about Azure DevOps is that I can run jobs in the cloud, which probably seems very straightforward, and that's what the cloud is. But many people don't know that I could run jobs from the cloud on-prem. That's mostly what I'm going to focus on tonight. But the concept between running jobs in the cloud or running jobs on-prem is essentially the same. You configure a pipeline. That pipeline has a bunch of items that you configure. This is the script I want to run. This is the environment I want to run it in. These are the credentials I want to run it as. This is the time I want to run it, and I want it to repeat X amount of times. And then once you set those things, Azure DevOps runs in the background for you. The reason that I'm excited about Azure DevOps is because if we step back for a second, we talk about task scheduling inside the Windows environment. What options do we have today? We basically have one. We have Task Scheduler. And Task Scheduler, it's fine. It works great. There's PowerShell commandlets for scheduled tasks. There's PowerShell commandlets for scheduled jobs, although scheduled jobs didn't make it into PowerShell 7. And of course, you have third-party solutions that you could add on, Jenkins, PowerShell Universal. There's lots of choices out there. But a lot of people don't realize that Azure DevOps is a legitimate option for replacing that task scheduler. And what do you get when you use Azure DevOps as a replacement? Forget about the fact that you're doing on-prem for a second. Your scheduling engine is now not maintained by you. It's a software as a service. So that is now maintained by Microsoft. You just run the jobs and it reaches out to the agents that you configured. In this case, obviously I have an on-prem agent. But the point is that I am now relying on Microsoft and their reliability to give me an environment that works. And when I kick off jobs, particularly in the Azure, 100% dependent on Microsoft. But the cool thing is I don't need to provision anything. Azure DevOps will spin up resources just in time in order to run that job that I need to run in the cloud. And then when it's done, it'll throw away. And I pay for just a small sliver of time that job ran in the Azure cloud. On-prem is a little different. I have an agent that runs here, but the Azure DevOps service will run that job. It will check the code out, pass it down to the on-prem agent. On-prem agent will do some work. But what a lot of people don't know about Azure DevOps is it's surprisingly cheap to use as an automation engine. Yeah. So let's take a look at that for a second here. Before I jump to that, I should probably just mention that to get to the Azure DevOps website, it's dev.azure.com. And when you go there, you'll be prompted to create an account. Whatever account that you decide to make, that's your link. So my Azure DevOps environment is dev.azure.com/mkanakos. I'm authenticated through normal Azure means of authentication, and I'm in. And when I get there, what you will see will be, this is the default view. And I'm going to take you through this in a second. So that's how you get to the cloud. Now you have a GUI, right? It's a web page. And I wanted to point out there's a number of services that are available in the DevOps cloud, the first thing that you start with is a project. And inside a project, it consists of these 5 pieces here: boards, repos, pipelines, test plans, and artifacts. Now let's take a step back for a second. This all sounds very DevOps, and this sounds maybe a little intimidating for a sysadmin. But if we go back and we look at this for a second, if you're a sysadmin and your goal is to create scripts that you need to schedule and run every day, I need to produce reports, I need to do AD maintenance, I need to check status of services for on-prem resources, jobs that are basically set once, write a script, and I just need it to run over and over again. Well, you don't need agile planning, and you probably don't need test plans, and you probably don't need artifacts. And you see here, you can turn on or off these features. So now let's take away those 3 features. And what do we have? We have a pipeline and we have a repo. And now all of a sudden, Azure DevOps doesn't sound so scary. So what I've done here in my environment is, sorry, I'm to Windows here. If I go into you see here these 2 icons? Just to show you a quickie, here's the 5 icons, here's 2. I've shut off those 3 icons. I don't need boards. I don't need test plans. I don't need artifacts. So now when I come into my project, I have a repo and I have the pipelines themselves. And this interface here is just the recent pipelines. I go here, this is all the pipelines that I ran. And the interface is pretty easy to understand. Green is good, red is bad. And I can drill and I can see more. So that's the interface. And this is the reason that I wanted to talk about this, because when you dumb this down, it's a lot easier to understand. But at first blush, when you look at Azure DevOps and oh man, it's artifacts and test plans and boards and whoa, that's not for me. The truth is, take away those pieces and think about the things that you might need as a sysadmin doing on-prem jobs. And now all of a sudden, it's a pretty robust little tool here. And we're going to talk about that more in a second. Let me just take a quick look at my notes, make sure. Oh, I wanted to talk about the cost. So I do have a link here. The link is azure.microsoft.com ENUS pricing calculator. I'm going to go there right now because this is probably pretty surprising to most people. When you get there, this is the pricing calculator for the Azure services. On the left-hand side, you can go down to DevOps over here, and then you could pick up, where'd it go? Azure DevOps.
It's still in web. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so now you get this little tool here. And if you look at this, if you go through this here, I'm going to try to explain this to you. So the basic plan, which is what everybody would probably start with, okay, it costs 0. Okay, what happens when I actually start to add users? It's 0. 2 users, 0. 3, 4, 5. When I get to my 6th user, it's $6 a month. So how many organizations have people who have to schedule automation and need more than 5 users that need to go into their DevOps console? If it's less than 5, this service costs nothing. Okay, if you need to do test plans, that's a different story, and it gets very pricey. But as I said, you probably don't need that. You can rock on the free plan, and what that will allow you to get is a number of things. So self-hosted pipelines, you are allowed to have 1 self-hosted pipeline, which is what I'm running, which means you can install 1 agent on a server on your environment, and you can run that, and you can run 1 job at a time, and it is free. So we now have a service that has pipelines and repos. Up to 5 users can log in and work in the terminal. You can have jobs scheduled in there. You can't run more than 1 at a time, but all jobs that you run are absolutely free, no matter how much runtime there is. So now when you start to look at this, you say, wow, this is a pretty cool solution. Maybe I need some more time. I want to start extra agents, 3, 4, 5 agents. Sure, maybe it gets a little expensive, but remember, this is parallel jobs at the same time. How many times are you going to have 4 jobs running at the exact same time? If you don't need that, bring this down. My point is here is you can build yourself a scheduling engine for most organizations for probably about $200, $300 a year, and you can build up as you go. So seems like probably a service that might not be intended for our use cases, when you dig in, is actually a pretty good use case for what we want to do. So let me just jump back in my notes here and see what else I wanted to mention. As I mentioned, surprisingly cheap. I talked about my lab setup. I have an Active Directory on-prem domain, Azure AD out in the cloud, Azure DevOps, my automation engine, Git repos where I'm posting my code, pipelines is the engine, and the project is what brings it all together. So let me show you that a little bit right now. Let me just stop there. Phil, anybody have any questions or anything they need me to go back and cover again?
I think the question was setting up multiple projects, and then do you need to disable those services per project, or is it you can set it globally?
I am not sure of the answer. What I know is that you need to set them per project. And what I thought I would do is just to give everybody a quick glance here. I have demos set up in my project, but I thought it'd be fun if we did everything, right? And whenever I can't get it to work, we'll just dump back to what I have pre-built. So what I want to do is let's make a project, let's set up a repo, let's set up some pipelines, and let's run some jobs. And if it gets too tedious and cumbersome, we'll just run the ones I've built in. And everybody can then see each part of the puzzle. So here I am, I'm at my top level. I have a project. I want to make a new project. It's right here. We're going to call this RTP Live, right? And do I want to make this project public or private? I want to make it private. So this takes about 30 seconds. And there you go. So by the default, I have everything enabled on the side here. So what is not completely obvious at first is when you bring this, and I'm sorry, some things are popping up here, but in the bottom left is a project settings button. And that is easy to miss when you're looking at the interface. So when you go to project settings, you'll now have a bunch of things that you can set specific to the project. So what I'm going to go here is, and I forgot already where it is. Settings is how long data is kept. Let me just see if I can remember where that is. Make a project, turn off what you need. Yeah, of course I didn't make a note for myself and what was under, but let me just go through real quick because it's one of these. Project configuration, no. I'm sorry, I'm not going to waste your time with this. We'll look real quick. Overview. I thought it was right off the top. Oh man, I feel like a dummy now. Oh, it was off the top. It was just to scroll down. I'm sorry. So right when you go into the project overview, you just have to scroll down and I can turn off what I don't want. So here I am. I'm going to get rid of these services, test plans I don't need. And for what I'm looking to do, I don't need artifacts. Now we can talk sidebar, and there's plenty of people on this call that are doing more DevOps oriented stuff. And they would probably say that you absolutely need test plans and artifacts and you want to have a little bit more of a game plan, but not for what I'm looking to do. So I shut those off. I can come in here and I can set some permissions, but for what I need to do, I'm a global admin, a lab, so I'm ready to go the way I am here. I can change notifications. I can get very granular here and set what comes up here, and I'll show you what that looks like for a second. If I go here, and I jump into my email. So every time right now with the default settings, when I run the jobs, where are my builds today? I get a notification, and you probably don't want to know about every notification, and you can tweak that. Come on, I'm waiting for my email to catch up to me while we're talking. So you can come in here and customize this, what you want to be notified, what you don't want to be notified for. Let's just go in here for a second. So if I pull up my mail for a second, you can see here, see all these Azure DevOps emails. This is every time I ran a job, a notification that came to let me know. So what we do at my work is we have two projects, and we have what we call a prod project and we have a test project. And the prod project is where code lives that's running on a schedule, and we get notifications on what runs and what fails. We have a test project that is essentially the same code, right? But you don't schedule jobs there, and you can test and it doesn't notify out on every fail of every job and email 5 people in your group when you're trying to change settings and you run a job 30 times trying to figure out the settings. So we have a test pool and we have a prod instance that we use, and they're supposed to be the same. The stuff that is important lives in prod, and you play and test. So I have this Azure DevOps demo here, right? Oh, excuse me, wrong one. Let me go to RTP Live. All right, so when I start off, I get pipelines and it's blank. And in pipelines, there's a number of different things here, which we'll talk about in a second. And I have repos. And repos, this is a Git repo. It's just hosted in Azure DevOps. So you can see commits and pushes and branches. And all I need to get started here is basically copy this link. And then I can come down to my terminal here, and I can just say git clone, right? And just, let's say new item, test PS1, right? Should be there. Oops. Just move it in the repo real quick. Okay, so I'm gonna come down here. I got a file, so what I'm gonna do this now is I'm gonna git add, git commit, this file, and I'm gonna push, all right? So we can talk about this if that doesn't seem familiar to people, but this is standard Git. And if you don't like working the command line, I could have done this from the Azure, from VS Code. But now if I go back over to my interface, there really should be no surprise here. If I go into a repo and I go into files, I have a file there. So I'm now working in the Azure cloud. I'm working at my local terminal, and I really didn't have to do anything to configure this. There's really no work to do. The hardest part of this whole setup is installing an agent and configuring maybe some permissions. So since we were talking about this on-prem setup for a second, let's go talk about this build agent for a second and what's involved with that. It's a pretty straightforward process. I'm not going to do a build agent config because it's 2 lines. So what I did is I grabbed a screen cap of this here, and I can make this bigger if that's easy to read. So what you do is you're running an agent, okay? You download an agent from the Azure DevOps website. Basically, so tell it what OS it's going to run on. So this can run on Windows, this can run on Linux. I pick the Windows agent, you unzip it in a directory, and you run. I'll show you here real quick in my build server.
So I think at this point, it's just good to put out, you're just walking through the steps, and it's not really important to talk about it. But what it is that there's a documentation. When you're ready to do it, follow the documentation and read the docs.
Yeah. The agent comes with 2 config files, 2 command files, right? You run config, and then when you're done, you run. And what happens when you run config is you get this prompts. Enter your server URL. Well, we went over this, dev.azure.com/mkanakos. You have to create a personal access token. If you're not familiar with that, you would go here and you would drop down right here and you'd say personal access token. And that's going to create a token and a super long key. And you copy out that key, you paste that key in here, and you hit enter. Now, check out what I had to do after that. It said enter the name of the agent pool. So just to bring everybody up to speed, I'm going to show you real quick on my existing Azure DevOps environment. Let me open up another window so we can have both open at the same time. So if I go here, I know that I haven't explained the internet interface, but I'm going to just jump through some stuff here. Pipeline. Okay, so by default, when you start up a new project, it creates some agent pools for you. So this is, I'll explain this one in a second. The default is Azure Pipelines that runs in the cloud, and default is just there. So it's empty. If you go in here, there's no agent. Okay, if I go into Azure Pipelines, Oh, I am looking. Oh, it's pulling in the history from my other one. Okay, so there's one agent, right? So what I'm configuring is, let me get back there, is the agent for this on-prem. Now, to be clear, this on-prem pool didn't exist. I created it. I just said add pool and I said give it a name. And then what I'm doing when I'm configuring this agent back over here in this screenshot, I'm just picking the name that I assigned in Azure DevOps, and it's going to add this agent to that pool. And then if you look at these settings here, I understand this window is not familiar to people, but if you go through these things, enter agent name, press enter if it's the name of your server. I hit enter, successfully added the agent. Do you want to run the agent as a service? Press Y. Okay, pick an account. If you don't, it's going to be NT server, network service. So I essentially answered two questions and went the equivalent of next, and I installed the agent. So it's not a challenging task. I think anybody on this call could handle this. It's download a zip, run a config, set up a pool. And then what's happening now is my agent is talking to the Azure cloud and waiting for work to come down. And then from there, it's the fun stuff. So let me show you what I've done a little bit and give you a little walk through the interface, because when it comes to creating jobs, there is a ton of choices. And this is why I want to spend a lot of time on the choices, because running the code is not the difficult part. Configuring the job to run can be a challenge in the beginning. So I'm going to jump back over to my existing demo here, and I'm going to go into pipelines, and these are existing jobs. I'm just going to make a new one just so we can look at it. Okay, so the very first thing it asks you is, where is your code? And I know exactly what everybody's going to think. Oh, it's in an Azure repo. No, you can do this, but I'm here to tell you that all these choices here are more difficult. In this tiny little text down here, it says use the classic editor. That's what I'm going to use tonight, because that's going to create a pipeline without YAML. So what we mean by without YAML is GUI interface. So when I click the classic editor, this goes away and I get a new interface. Am I using the Azure repos Git? Yes, I am. Okay, so I would say continue. It pre-populated everything. And then I get to this window, which is just equally as confusing. These are all the different things that could be run in my pipeline. However, I don't want any of these. I want to start with an empty job. And there's a reason for this, because it's much easier this way. So when I do that, I say, no, I don't want the YAML interface. Give me the classic editor. And no, I don't want to do any of this crazy stuff. Give me an empty job. I end up here. And what I have is the start of a new job. I can call it whatever I want. The name here or the name here are the same. So we're going to call this test job. Okay. Let's not worry about this section for a second. Let's stay over here. Where we're concerned with is this top line, and we're configuring settings for the pipeline. I'm calling the pipeline test job, and then I'm going to say, what pool do I want to use? On-prem. And that's it. That's all I need to configure for the pipeline. Now, what do I want the pipeline to do? Well, there's an agent that runs in the pipeline. I need to tell the agent what I want to do. And this agent is inheriting settings from the pipeline. I can go and set this manually if I want. I can override what I want here. But what I want to do is I want to tell the agent to run a script. And to do that, all I need to do is click this plus. And now I get an interface like we saw before. And there's all different things here that we can run. I'm going to stop here for a second and see if that makes sense, because I don't want to go too far ahead if it's a little confusing. Questions, comments, concerns? All right.
Doesn't look like there are any friends.
What was that?
Doesn't look like there's any questions.
Okay, perfect. So I can browse here, very simple, but it's a PowerShell user group. We're going to run some PowerShell. So I'm just going to go over here and I'm going to type PowerShell. And when I do that, it's going to tell me, well, what do you want to do? You want a PowerShell? You want PowerShell on remote machines? You want an Azure PowerShell? You want to run functions? Anything related to PowerShell is here. Every job I've ever configured, I just pick PowerShell. And what that does is it adds this to this pipeline. Now that I have this setting here that says I want to run a PowerShell script, when I click on this, I can now configure that. And here it's asking for a script path. Do you want to take a guess where it's going to pull from? It's going to pull from my Azure DevOps repo. Remember, this is in my pre-populated project, so I have all these scripts up here already. If we did this in the other one, it would just be one. So all I need to do is pick a script and say, okay. Now, if my script is set to run and permissions are all set, I don't need to do anything else. I can simply say save in queue and this job will run. However, most of the times that's not going to be the case, because if you remember back in this screenshot here, we said that this is going to run as a network service, which is basically code for this job has no rights. So there's an argument section in here. You can set up some arguments, and we're going to get into that in a second. But right now, I have configured a job. If I go save here, and this is, if you want to do comments, you can. I usually don't. Okay. I've saved this, and now I can just go back up one level, and I go into my pipelines, and here's that new job. So now I can run this, and running it is simply as easy as just say run pipeline. But I'm not going to do that yet. This is a little bit more involved that I want to talk about. But if I need to edit that, I can go back into here and I can just hit the edit button. And the reason I'm showing you all this is because, yes, we're a PowerShell group, and I love to do command line stuff and code, but I find doing the code version of what I'm doing here tedious. And I'm not very good at YAML. And this GUI interface, once you find your way around, is actually pretty helpful. So there's some things in here that I didn't cover that I want to go back now and dive in a little deeper on. So the first here is triggers. So triggers is where you can set a schedule. So I can say, when do I want this to run? I can pick a time zone if I have a specific time zone. And if I want to add more, I just add as many schedules as I want here. Now there is one limitation. This is a daily schedule. It's 24 hours. So you can pick the days. I want to have it run Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and I want to have it run at 4 o'clock and 10 o'clock. But through this interface, you can't say I want to have it run on the 15th of the month. You do that with YAML. And the YAML scheduling agent is much more robust than this, but it's a lot more cryptic. But so configuring jobs is a pretty simple task. And then this little checkbox here can say, I only wanted this to run if the build of the source changed. I'm not interested in that, so I uncheck that. And if you want to deal with branches, you could deal with branches. But what we're basically saying here is I have a script and I want to set up that script to run at a certain time and on certain days, and I just want it to run. I don't care about if the build changes or any of that stuff. I just want to automate a job. And this is the interface. Okay, so questions. Does this make sense so far?
I think this makes sense at this point, but I think the next question is like you just pointed out, is that you can do a lot more and you can dig into it, but at this point, this is really what you want.
And so we're going to expand on this. So one thing you probably are wondering is, Mike, you mentioned you have no rights. So how's this going to run? So why don't we talk about that for a second? So to do that, I'm going to jump into some code. All right. So if we open up here, let's take a look at what we got for scripts here. Oh, let's do like a set company info. All right. All right. So what I've done here is, let's look at this line here. I had said earlier that I need to pick a user. Let me jump in here and I need another user because I already set this already. Bear with me 1 second. I have a test lab here. I should have showed this earlier, and I have some test user accounts in here. And what I want to do is this script, what it does is it goes and it went and found this user, and it populated a company name for her organization. I populated this, so it won't run. So I'm going to pick another user here. Let's try S. Horton. Okay. Okay. If we work from the bottom up, simple AD commandlet. I'm setting the company attribute on this username S. Horton. However, I'm going to use a credential to give myself the rights to do it, because the service that's going to run this is network service, and network service is not going to have the ability to make these changes. If I was doing an AD query, get AD user, something like that, I don't necessarily have to put permissions in unless I want to do something really crazy, because most people can browse Active Directory. But when I want to make changes, that's a different story. So to do that is a really simple way we do that. So what we've done is we've built two parameters at the top here, and we're going to pass in a user ID and a password. Okay, and we're going to take those two credentials and we're going to make a secure string, and then we're going to make a credential object. Okay, so what we're doing is I'm going to pass in some user ID, we're going to pass in some password from Azure DevOps. The script is going to take that password that got passed in as a parameter, and it's going to create it to a secure string. And then I'm making a second object here called credential. So it's just a pre-s credential object. And then once I have this credential object, I can now run this command as another. So that's what we're looking to accomplish. So how do we do that? All right, I got to push this up because I just changed the thing here. Okay, so what I did is I just changed this username, so I just pushed it up there. So let's go back now to the interface and talk about how that works. So the one thing I did not show you yet, and I'm going to actually find this job so we can play along. We're going to leave. Who cares about that? Pipelines. So set on-prem company info is the job that runs that script. And let's bring everybody up to speed here. So just to go through the interface again, title of the job. I've picked the on-prem pool. My agent is going to run a PowerShell script. A PowerShell script is set company info. And here I'm passing in some arguments, which I'm going to explain in a second. And I'm also going to show one other thing that I haven't discussed yet. You see this blue icon. Hopefully that makes everybody aware that this is a PowerShell 5 agent. What happens if you want to run PowerShell 7? Right here, use PowerShell core. So if I leave this off, it's just going to use the PowerShell 5.1 engine to run this. For what I'm doing with AD, that has no difference. I'll leave it as PowerShell core. Now, let's talk about this for a second here, because this can be a bit confusing. What I'm doing is I'm saying in this job, there's two parameters in the script. User ID and password, okay? So here I'm saying I have a parameter called user ID and a parameter called password. And for those parameters, I'm going to pass in this variable, which you don't know about yet, and this variable, which you also don't know about yet. So what I'm trying to get to is there is a way to store credentials in here. You can use Azure Key Vault, but there's a much simpler way. Inside a project, inside pipelines, you have a library. And a library is a way for you to store variables. So what I have done is I created a variable group. This is not here by default. I created this group, it's called credentials. And in credentials, I stored two variables. I stored a variable called RTP-SUG service account ID, and this is the user ID. Yes.
Could you make the screen just a little bit larger?
Yeah, sure. Is that any better?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
Sorry about that, guys. I meant to do that earlier. Thank you for the reminder. Okay, so let me just get back on track here. So inside of our project at the pipeline level, I'm in the library. It's not so obvious at first, but there's a library and I can put any variables I want in here. I don't have to make credentials. Maybe I need to put variables in for OS names or whatever. I can create all kinds of variables and then set values for those variables and pass them into my scripts. So in this case, what I've done is I've created variables that represent user IDs. So I have a user ID and a password. I created the variable name, and this is the value. So this is the account and AD that I want to run my script. And here is the password. And then as you can see, I'm going to zoom this out for 1 second. It's starred. And if I unlock this, it doesn't show. I'm going to wipe it out here because I have a super safe password. And when I enter that password and I click the lock, it's now a secure password. So what's going to happen is if we go back, and I'm going to zoom out for a second, these variables are going to be used in my script. If I go back to my pipeline, I want to stay and I have to save this because I made a change. If I go back to the pipeline and I go back to that company prem here and I go to edit, remember we said the agent is going to run a PowerShell script. And when I click on that PowerShell script, it's going to run this script. And now it makes sense what I'm doing here. I'm going to pull in those variables from the library, pass them into these parameters. Those parameters will be used on the script. The script will process those usernames and passwords. And now I have a credential object, and now I can run my job on-prem as a different user. So that seems like a lot of steps, but actually it's not, because once you do it, chances are, if you're doing it like you're using a service account, you may use the same service account for all your jobs. So then all you need to do, you literally can copy and paste this line and save it. And you have to go here to this variable section. And the only catch here is you have to go to variable groups and you have to say link. All we're saying is, hey, for this script, I want to link the library to the script. When I do that, it now says these two are available to me. Imagine if you had lots of variables and lots of groups, you might want to pick the ones you want. The way I do it, we just have a subset of credentials one I want to use, and this is how we pass them in. And we essentially have the same settings for every job we run with the arguments. So what seems a little confusing now becomes very easy because it becomes repetitive. So we pick a different script, we just use the same credentials because it's a service account, and maybe we configure some other things here. Maybe we change some triggers, but it's essentially the same setting for every job. We're just changing the scripts. And oh, by the way, if I want to run more than one script, I can put multiple scripts here and I can add as many as I want. And the agent will go through and execute these scripts in order and do whatever it is that you like. Maybe you need to run a PowerShell script, and then you need to follow that up by a command interface. And then maybe after that, you need to do some bash. Of course, that doesn't seem logical, but the point is, see how easy this is to do? Now, of course, for each one of these, you'll have to set up some settings, right? And each one of them have logical settings. But once you get used to this interface, you get a lot of options that, honestly, you just can't do in the task scheduler. And remember, I picked an on-prem job here. I could have changed this to a hosted job. And if I needed to do stuff in the Azure cloud, I can use the same engine with the same choices, make some different changes, and now my job is running out in the cloud.
So Mike, as we're running these jobs, where does the logs or like the history and all that go? Is it just stored in Azure DevOps, or where does it go?
So I'm going to leave this for a second here. Okay. And I might go back to my pipelines. So the history is with the job. Okay. So what you're seeing here is the name of the pipeline, the last run information, and how long it ran. But if I click on this, I can go in here and I can see the history. Now, let's jump in here. We could see here that this is my hello world. One ran, a couple were unsuccessful. When I click on this, I can go in here and I can go and I can see that agent job, and I can exactly see here. Now, this was the one that ran. Now, what happens is there's a process that goes on here, and the agent and starts the job. It checks out the job, which is basically pulling the code from the repository. It then runs the PowerShell script. And by the way, this name here is configurable. I left it to default. Then it does a checkout afterwards, and it cleans up. So when I ran this script, here's what happened. I just ran a simple command, and it just created a file. So this so what we did is we just created a file called Hello World. So if we do something a little more advanced, go to pipelines here, and we look at set on-prem company info, and we look at this one, and we look at the history. You'll see it basically is just telling that it executed the script. It doesn't give you information about what happened in the script unless the job fails. So if the job fails.
But you could put in logging there if you want. You can write to the console if you want.
But what we do is we usually keep our logs on-prem anyway. So we just have part of the script create a log and output it to something local on the network. So these are failed ones. And when I go into a failed one here, it tells me exactly 2 errors here, and I can dive in here and I can actually see, and it's very easy to see here. I did not have privileges to run this operation. And it usually, this one is a cloud job. Let me go back to a different one because I want to show you something specific. Did this one fail? No. Find one with failure.
You put like the password in the command line, that kind of stuff. Is that in the log? No.
That's just passed in.
Okay.
All right. I'm trying to find one that failed here. Of course, I can't find it that failed now.
I think what Phil's asking is that credential doesn't get logged in plain text. Is
no.
I want to make sure of.
Now, that's as far as I know. If I'm making a mistake here and I'm wrong, I'll be the first to admit it. But as far as I know, it doesn't. Okay, so here's another one that's a little bit more, hopefully a little bit more verbose. So here, exited account. Now look, it tells me in the code here.
So if you scroll right there, what does it show? Scroll
Yeah,
right.
I just gotta make it a little smaller. I know this is hard for you guys to see when it's this small. So connecting to remote server failed with the following errors message, access denied. So I was trying to do remoting here. Okay, and this is the line in the script that it failed. It's hard to see here, but normally when it fails, it underlines the failed part of the code. This whole line failed, so it underlined the whole thing.
That's like the debug log. For,
right. Yeah.
In PowerShell itself, would show you there.
So nothing extravagant here, but the point is you can come in here pretty quickly and figure out like what went wrong.
So if you're doing this kind of stuff, you can do somebody brought up in the questions saying the idea of passing data from one script to another kind of stuff. And so you could write to the local disk and then basically pick it up in the next script off the local disk. You could do that kind of stuff. Or have you had any experience in putting and passing data from one part of the job to the next part of the job?
So I'm going to tell you that I haven't done too much of that, but I want to bring up a point that is being forgotten. I haven't mentioned it yet, but let's think about this. Hey, Phil, can you count along with me?
Yep.
Let's call this hop 1. What's this one?
2.
So what's the next one?
3.
And what happens when you try to do that in PowerShell?
Well, it's a double hop problem.
Double hop.
Yeah. So you have to work around those issues. And it's not something that's first thought of, right? Because we've moved the execution outside of the network. So you're almost always going to hit some sort of double hop issue if you need to do what you guys just asked. I need to pass and do things. If you're passing between scripts, maybe not. But if I need to now go from this box to other boxes and then do things, it can get to be a challenge. But what you can do is what I did with the credentials, because when I'm running the script here and I'm using a credential object and I'm authenticating, I'm not being penalized for this first hop. I'm on the network and authenticated, and then I can go and do what I got to do. So yeah, just wanted to point that out because it's often overlooked.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
The log you were looking at, do you know how long it takes before you max out this buffer? Like I have that issue on Azure Automation and functions.
When we talk about log, what's being logged, right? Because this is just the execution of the job. There's really nothing
Right.
being logged in here about the job, about the script that executed. Like, for example, at work, one of the jobs that we run is we are synchronizing our Workday data with Active Directory because we're hybrid and we can't do it through the cloud. So we had to design our own sync script. So 3 times a day, we're synchronizing 25,000 accounts for any changes in Workday. None of that shows up in Azure DevOps because that's all specific to the script. How the job executed will be here. So essentially, there's nothing.
So in my script, I do a lot of write output just to,
Yeah.
you know, and I guess part of that is, that's a good point. Like for me, it's partially debugging in case something didn't happen. I want to go back and comb through all the logs and see on that particular run, did it pick up this or whatever? And yeah, I max out this. So maybe I should come up with a better logging solution too, instead of writing to the console write output.
So what we've done is, in that situation, is we built a log writing utility that just outputs what happened on each line to a text file, and that's happening now. The log output is happening on the local machine that the script is being executed on, which is basically here rather than out in the cloud. So the log exists here. So the next problem for us is that we have multiple job servers, so that if one's down or if we want to run parallel, so then we just have to write that log out to a share or something like that, or else you got to go to the box that ran the job to find the log. So sometimes it becomes more complex because you're doing more things, but that's how we've gotten around it so far.
What's been your experience, Jason, as far? At what point should people on this call even get concerned? Like, how big are we talking about?
Man, how many pages? I think it's somewhere around 1,000 lines.
Oh, that's a lot of content. So, yeah.
It is. It does a lot.
Be less verbose.
So I have the script that we're running that does that sync is 400 lines, but it doesn't output a bunch of stuff to the console. It's just doing the AD updates. So it's probably not as buffer intensive as you might be. But I'm having no problems with scripts that are at 300 and 400 lines right now. But I also want to back up for a second because I know Jason and I know the kinds of work that he does. And Jason seems like he's doing some pretty cool stuff. Remember, this may not be the perfect solution, but I think this is a whole hell of a lot better than the task scheduler. And that's the focus I think we need to keep here. Now, maybe if you're doing DevOps oriented stuff and you want to go down that path, and maybe someone can talk about that better than I could. But if we're talking about executing a job on a Windows server and, oh crap, the server went down last night, none of our jobs ran, that kind of stuff, I feel like this, with a little bit more setup, is a lot more robust. And essentially free if it's for a couple of users. I know I didn't exactly answer Jason's question there. Do we have any others that are popping up? I haven't looked at the chat since we started.
No, I think one of the questions that Ryan brought up is just interesting. Is just the idea of that sometimes he sets up scheduled tasks to run its startup on the server kind of stuff, but that's really not what this is looking for. He's thinking of trying to get the pipeline scheduler to hook into some of those events, but I don't think there's a way to trigger that. Or do you know if there's a way to trigger a pipeline remotely? This is PowerShell, so we should be able to get a PowerShell script to kick off the PowerShell job or the pipeline job.
Yeah, but you got to remember the engine that's running out in the cloud has no sort of sense of the start of a build server down line, right? And how would it know that? You can query whether the service is up or down, but I don't know of a way right now to run a job that says when the agent comes online. This goes back to what I said in the beginning of the talk, which is I'm showing you what we've done from our corporate solution to schedule jobs. I certainly haven't exhausted all the possibilities.
No, I think what he was looking at, he thought a task scheduler as a replace task scheduler, but this is almost like a centralized task scheduler in that it's an overarching, not, hey, just a task scheduler running on some random machine. But then also the idea, somebody's brought up the idea of kicking a trigger off from a webhook. Like you could do that. You can ping a webhook.
Yeah, I'm sure you can do all that. I haven't personally done that. Again, I know there's a lot more that can be done. We are basically running regular jobs at regular intervals to do things that we don't want to have to do manually. That's the intention for most of the work we do. And that's also a byproduct of the guys that are on the team. This is all still new to us. So as we get better with the tools, we take on bigger challenges, but none of us have had a need to do that yet. And as Jeremy mentions here, if some of the stuff could be replaced with Azure Functions, maybe that's a better solution for some of this stuff, right? So we've gone through a pipeline and how to configure one. I can run some of these pipelines and show you different examples of what's going on. My concern is that the code that executes is not so exciting to watch as it is to build the jobs. So I think maybe we would want to go through building some jobs, but it's really an open-ended forum here. It's what the group prefers. I'd be happy to do. I'm ready to run these and show you different things you can do. But honestly, you're going to say, oh, okay, I created an AD user report. Big deal. It's the building of the job that's the interesting part to me. So is there any desire from anybody to do one or the other? All right. So why don't I just go through some of the stuff I have here?
Just from a PowerShell perspective, is that you can do most of this from, you can create this task from PowerShell. You can do it from there. You can create the YAML itself. Is that what you're saying?
So I didn't show that. We can do that. Let me go back.
I just want to give people that functionality is that, hey, you could create these tasks or these pipelines in bulk, that kind of thing. But it's probably a lot easier to do it using GUI.
Or start here, because when you go into this, I might have to ask Stevie for some help here. Where the hell is the job? View YAML. And now I have the thing. So obviously with a bigger job, there'll be more to see. But now I can take this, I can paste this into a file and I can build upon this. But if you're not comfortable with YAML, starting here might be hard. So what I do is I usually start and get through the GUI, and then when the job is done, I copy out the YAML and then build on that. So what I would do here is, if I need to do a more complex schedule, I would definitely want to do it in YAML because I can use cron. And the cron syntax is as cryptic as it comes, and I'm not going to be able to type that up right off the top of my head, but at least I can get the format of the YAML started, and then I can just come in and pop that in. And then once I get a schedule in here, so none of these are scheduled. So let's put a schedule on some of this for a second. Trigger, and we'll say add here, and that's fine. Save.
So those are the only two kinds of triggers, the schedule or build completion?
As far as, well, in this setup, as far as I know.
Can you trigger one job on the completion or base it upon the completion of another?
I don't know.
So can't you chain one job from another? Or
so you can have multiple jobs here. Yes, I can then pull in my next script that I want to run. That's good, and this will go sequentially down the line. So yes, you can chain jobs together. Chain scripts that are executing within a job together. Can I chain jobs together, pipeline jobs together? That I don't know.
You can do that, but you have to get out of the pipelines area and get into the releases.
Okay.
Okay.
And
so that the organization tries is like the jobs live within a pipeline, and then the pipeline lives within a release.
So the thought process there is what Mike's doing here is great, and he and I have actually talked about this a little bit before, in that it's exceptional and very clever about what he's trying to do. However, as soon as you want to do a little bit more with it, like what you're talking about, when you want to start chaining things together, then you should use the builds to generate your content, and then you use the releases to actually do the work. And so then you can do things like you can build modules inside your build, and then based on how successful those are, then those move on to the next step. And then the orchestration engine actually happens in the release. But that's a lot more complicated than what this is set up to do.
Okay, so at that point, so some of the things that you disabled initially to kind of basically simplify this is that if you want to get more advanced, the advanced pieces are available to you, but you'll have to just enable all those things. And so that's what you get when you move to the 2.0.
Yeah, and I think this is essentially the classic interface problem that happens with very granular tools. Where do you start? There's a lot of possibilities and a lot of choices. So I've started at the pipeline level, replicating what I view as like a scheduled job. Stephen, who was just talking, views this same tool in a completely different manner and looks at it from a release level and artifacts and builds. That's not my use case, so I don't even see that in the tool as a way of operating. So that's why I really wanted to spend most of the time tonight focusing on interface and showing how you can get around this tool, because I think once you comprehend the pieces, you really can go pretty far with this stuff once you get a comfort level here.
I think I finally got it. Yeah, good.
So one thing I did want to show is invoking, because that kind of is how I get one way I get around my double hop thing. So maybe that would be interesting to people. Just to bring you up to speed here, I have two scripts here. Three jobs, excuse me. The start and stop a service, right? That's a common thing that you might want to schedule, or checking on services on multiple machines. And the way that I'm doing that here, let me just get that script open. I didn't have it open. So is exactly what we said before. We're passing in a user ID and password, creating a credential object. And then remember, this is going to execute on that box. So from that build box, I'm going to invoke to my DC, and in this case, start a service, and I need credentials to do that. So I pass in credentials. Now, this list could be extensively long, and I could easily invoke to many boxes and do things. Same thing with my stop. So there's the same thing, right? The point being is it's an easy way to get on the build box, and then from the build box, jump to many machines and have the power of PowerShell do the work that you need through invoking or some other method. That's why I said none of these scripts are super exciting. It's the concepts behind them that I want everybody to understand. Now, I have not even mentioned running stuff in the cloud, but it's essentially the same process. Now, my pipeline for the cloud isn't working, but it doesn't really matter because scheduling the job is what we're interested in. So if I go and I look here and I say enable Azure AD, and when I say it doesn't work, it's because I haven't set up the permissions. I can actually run this, it's just going to fail. But when I go and I edit this, now this is a cloud-based job, Azure pipelines, okay? It's not very different. Now, because I'm in Azure, I have a different agent, right? So I have some agents that I can choose here. This is the default, that's what I went with. And since I'm now running in the cloud, I have to add what I want to do with it. Instead of PowerShell, I added Azure PowerShell, and the only thing it asked for was, after I did that, it wanted a service principal. So in the subscription, it reads, and the first time you do this, it'll create a service principal for you, and that's what's going to execute this script for me in the cloud. And it's asking what script I'm going to run here, and if I want to pass in arguments, I can do all that same stuff. My only requirement here is I have to pick a version of the PowerShell, Azure PowerShell that I want to run, and I am not that familiar with it, so I just went with the latest one. But it's essentially the same configuration as an on-prem job. And once I get my feet wet with one or the other, scheduling stuff in the cloud or on-prem is, dare I say, the similar process, right? This job will run, but it'll fail because the service principal I have running it doesn't have credentials to finish. And it'll execute, and it'll be the exact same thing. If I go here and I go into the history, and you'll see here, it takes a little longer to run in the cloud because what it's doing is it's spinning up an instance real quick. It's setting up the modules, right? And then it's kicking off stuff here. So script takes a little bit longer to run, but not painfully slow, right? So this one took 40 seconds. Some of the other ones took 15 seconds. So I'm concerned that this may have went over some people's heads, and I want to make sure that we've covered the basics before we even attempt anything else. This could be enough to consume for one evening right here. It really depends on how well this came across to people. And since I've been doing this every day for the last 8 months, this all seems second nature to me, and I don't really have a problem with it. But I know that's not the case for someone who's glancing at this for the first time. I didn't show that I could see my commit history here and all that good stuff. So how are we doing with questions? Is there something that I need to cover again that maybe someone doesn't understand?
Curious about the cost involved again.
Sure.
Does it cost more to, for example, to do that cloud-based job? Obviously, it's firing up some kind of VM.
So the answer is it depends. Microsoft recently changed their policy, and when you go into the pools, it says there's a hosted agent, but somewhere along the lines, they pulled back the ability for everybody to run free jobs in the cloud. So now what happens is when you go to run it, it says, hey, you don't have an agent that can do parallelism. Would you like to apply for a free agent? And you fill out a form, and it takes about 7 business days, and they will give you a free agent. So it is essentially free. There's 1,800 minutes of runtime a month. That's running one job at a time, though. If you need more parallel jobs to run, you need more agents, and agents can get a little pricey. I think they're $15 a month per agent, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And each purchase includes runtime, and it's based on the amount of runtime. On-prem.
Do you know if there's a? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead. Do I know if?
No, I was just curious if there's a time limit on.
If there's, so how long one job can run?
Yep.
I want to say, and I'm not 100% of this, I want to say it's an hour, but I don't know that to be 100% true.
Cool.
That's a good question, though. I'm pretty sure that's the case because I have had jobs that have hung and they've killed them after an hour. So I'm assuming that's the default, and I don't know if there's a programmatic way to get around that or if that's just built in. But that's what I've seen in our use case. Now, going back to the cost. So there's a cost to run things in the cloud, but you can apply for a free agent, and then you can run stuff. On-prem is essentially no cost if you just need one agent and a couple of users. If you need to run multiple agents on-prem, I think it's $6 an agent a month, something like that from the calculator. It's pretty inexpensive considering. Just looking at the chat here and thinking. Now, I see some active discussion going on about releases and builds and all that stuff. And you know what? That's probably what we should be doing. I'm not going to get on this call and say that this is the best way to do this. this is one solution to a problem. And as Stephen noted, and I'm sure Jason is familiar with, and some of the other guys that are a little bit more advanced, the releases and some of the other ways to do builds may afford many more options. But for me, it seems like a longer upstart time to get up to speed with the technology for the simple things that I want to do. But
Mike,
remember, I don't think this is the only way to go.
I think it's funny. Earlier, you mentioned how some people might think this is better to do in an Azure function or whatever. I completely disagree. I'm trying to look at this and see. And in fact, I think I saw where one of your options was to update a function. I would like to take my function and put it into Azure DevOps, where basically, here's the code in a repo, make use of test branches and whatnot. And yeah, when there's a change to the master branch, go run that job.
Yep.
Stuff like that. Yeah, I think this is a great orchestration tool for your functions, whether it's PowerShell or Azure Function or whatever.
I agree. And I will tell you that when you go into a job here, the way for this demo, I didn't schedule anything to fire on a trigger, but yeah, definitely that option is absolutely there. If you want to work on a change of code, fire off a job, that's a cool way to go. And it does have the ability to support branches and different kinds of things. I would say that I'm really only scratching the surface of what's possible here. The problem is, I think for me, is we could probably spend a lot more time talking about this, but I think there's a segment of the people that are on the call that this has never been seen before, and this was a lot to absorb. And then there's a segment of people on the call that have seen some of this before and are ready to go on to 201 and 301 stuff. And I don't want to make the mistake of trying to stuff too much into one meeting. I think we could come back and we can do deeper dives on this stuff. But I think the point that I was trying to make here is that pretty much any admin that runs a Windows shop could probably get away setting this up reasonably in an hour or two, fumbling around the settings, or if there's some good documentation, and be running jobs from a cloud-based automation engine or orchestration engine, as Jason says. And I think that is probably the best way to look at it. Now, I saw someone post PowerShell Universal in there, another excellent option for scheduling jobs on-prem. I'm going to go back to the beginning of my talk and say that option wasn't afforded to me. So we had to live in the cloud. So this is why we ended up where we are. But
one of the other options there, as you said, is you built a Windows system as your build agent, but you could certainly have a Linux box be your build agent or something else in PowerShell core. And so, not to even say that anybody here who's just hey, if I just want to use this account here and I want to kick off jobs on some Linux box to do some other stuff that happens to be somewhere else, that is certainly possible for you. I don't want to necessarily isolate us to a Windows admin kind of thing because, hey, this would be a great thing for me simply just do some of the Linux stuff that I'd like to do.
And so you're exactly right. So I really limited this down to AD, and obviously that's not the case. Obviously, you can do a lot more than AD, but AD in Windows is where I went. But to your point, one interface, it's fine running in the Linux world or the Windows world or Azure Cloud. And it's not a challenging interface to absorb once you understand where the parts are. And I think that's one of the things that is a feather in the cap here of the tool, because if you go and you look at a script runner product, no knock on them, they make a fantastic tool, but I don't remember watching and seeing much in the way of Linux on them. My point being is most of the tools that we put as third party, a lot of them are still have a Windows focus, unless it's something like Jenkins or something like that. So a lot of choices here.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Mike. I think that was good. We could certainly have some more discussion in the future, but do you have any final words there, Mike?
No. The only other thing I was going to talk about was that invoke. If anybody wants to see that, we can run that. But I was wondering myself if maybe we're at a natural place to wrap up here. But the idea here is that, so there's one thing I didn't cover on that build box. Okay. This build box is essentially running the jobs that you want to schedule out. So I only talked about installing the agent, but don't forget, this box also needs the tools that you need to run. So I didn't show it tonight, but I installed the RSAT tools on this box so I can run the AD commandlets. If you need other modules, you need to install them on your build boxes. Now you could schedule that through a job to install those agents, install those modules and things like that. But I didn't mention it, and it's worth mentioning. The build box runs an agent, but it also has the tools on there to do the things that you're going to schedule on it. The reason you see Teams here is I pulled down Office last night on this box because I ran a user report and I wanted to just open it. We didn't even get to that, and that's okay if we don't. But keep in mind, your build boxes have to have the tools and able to run the commandlets that you're going to push down to it to execute.
I guess you have to install PowerShell core if you're going to check the box for PowerShell
Yep.
core.
Let's give a plug where, come on, catch up to me. I'm just doing it the easy way. So I pulled this stuff down with Chocolatey, and that's how I set up my machine. And it makes it easy. And then, so what I've done at home and what you can do is I set a scheduled job to kick off a Chocolatey update once a day. So I don't have to worry about updating this. This is probably a good place to break. Let me say thank you for watching tonight. If you're watching at home, there's more content on our YouTube channel where you're seeing this. So take a look at our other videos. We have content on most of the topics that relate to PowerShell. We'd love to have you stick around and see some more. And if you get the chance to come and join us for a live meeting, you can see us on meetup.com. We meet on the first and third Wednesday of the month. Thank you very much, and thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Click and subscribe.